Mr. Altman.
Mr. Patrick, let's now look at penalty points under the contract, please. In your witness statement, paragraph 99, we don't need to look at it. You said that there was no correlation between penalties and savings. Is that right?
Correct.
And there was no trade-off between understaffing and savings, is what you also say.
Mm-hmm.
You were aware, were you, of monthly performance reports?
I was aware that they would be done. I wasn't copied into the monthly reports, other than via the trading reviews.
Other than by?
The trading reviews.
Yeah. I think you say in your witness statement you saw a summary of them.
Yeah, like I say, at the monthly trading reviews.
And the idea under the contract was that G4S was expected to self-report
Correct.
failures, which inevitably relied upon people reporting honestly.
Indeed.
Were you ever concerned that, did you ever know whether any reports of failures under the contract were being hidden?
No, and if I was aware, I would have taken corrective action, because my stance was very well known, that I expected people to report accurately and honestly.
Are you confident that in all cases, particularly during the period we're dealing with, that reports were always made honestly and accurately?
I have absolutely no evidence to the contrary.
No. Stephen Skitt made a witness statement to the inquiry. We don't need to put it up unless you wish to look at it. SER 000455 of page 55, his paragraph 191, where he says he brought in the self-reporting system which is in use today. Did you know that?
No, but I interpret that as a refinement as opposed to anything else, because from day one of the contract there would have been a system.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
And we know that he joined Brook House in 2015.
Yes.
So was self-reporting just a practice, or was it something that was contractual?
It was contractual.
In his witness statement, and perhaps we should put this up again, DL 0000141 at page 40, please. We're back to Nathan Ward, and at the top of the page, in my time working for G4S, I observed a number of practices that are indicative of the culture in G4S and the manipulation of information, particularly in respect of staffing levels. This included reporting that people were operational when in fact they were not available to be operational to avoid penalty points. So, for example, officers who were on training days and were therefore not operational were commonly recorded as being operational within the IRCs, particularly towards the end of my time at Gatwick IRCs. I became aware of this because I shared an office with Michelle Brown, who was responsible for ensuring staffing levels met the contractual levels. And at 118, I also recall people being recorded as working full-time at Brook House when they were in fact at Tinsley House, which gave a false picture of who was working and avoided penalty points. And he goes on to give an example of that in the paragraph. What do you say about that, Mr. Petherick?
Well, I was certainly not aware of any such practice.
But if Reverend Ward is being accurate, that's a bit troubling, isn't it?
If he is being accurate,
No.
yes.
Well, do you have any reason to think that he's told lies in a witness statement?
I would hope not, no.
No, we would all hope not, but do you have any reason? No. No. When he gave evidence, and we can look at what he said. You've seen some of these transcripts, I assume.
I
Mr.
have. I
Petherick.
wouldn't say I've seen them in huge detail.
No, of course not. But INQ 000101. At page 38. And if we look at the top left, he was being asked about Schedule G of the contract. And at line 7, on page 149 of the transcript, abuse of detained persons, and this is a question, was not a specific failure within Schedule G that attracted penalty points. But were there penalty points awarded if there was a substantiated complaint against a member of staff? And he says, yes, penalty points would be awarded against a substantiated complaint, and therefore there was a great effort not to substantiate complaints. What do you think about that?
Well, again, I go back to what I've said in my statement and what I've said earlier, that my expectation is that people report accurately, investigate accurately, and so forth.
That's your expectation when you were MD. How confident can you be that that expectation filtered down to the people who were doing the reporting?
Well, I would expect the director, be it at Brook House or any other establishment, to reflect that downwards.
Yeah. But in the end, if Nathan Ward was being accurate and honest here, it looks like that message wasn't going where it ought to have gone.
Well, I can't speak for that. All I can say is that my expectation was very clear and very precise.
Can we look, please, at Schedule G, and if we can put up HOM 000921, please. Are you familiar with the terms of the contract, or were you?
I was. I won't say that.
No.
I still am.
Let's go to the next page, please. Page 2, and this is at the top. The heading under the schedule is performance evaluation. And then if we scroll down, we'll see a series of performance measures, and in the right-hand column, performance points per day. And under Roman 3, we have untoward events. And at letter C, self-harm resulting in injury, and the points to be awarded in self-harm resulting in injury, 400. If we move on then to page 5, because I want to take you to the definition of an untoward event. In the instance of self-harm resulting in injury, we see under Roman 3C, any known incident of deliberate self-harm resulting in physical injury, requiring any form of healthcare intervention, and involves any failure to follow laid down procedures for the safety of detainees as set out in Schedule D. So it comes to this, and you dealt with this in your witness statement, that an act of self-harm alone did not trigger an award of penalty points. First of all, it required physical injury resulting from the act.
Correct.
But presumably that could be any physical injury.
Yes, from
A scratch.
a scratch upwards, yes.
And second, involves any failure to follow laid down procedures for the safety of detainees as set out in Schedule D. And if we look at Schedule D, please, we'll come back to Schedule G. Schedule D, which is HOM 000798. And if we can just scroll down a page or two, first of all, wrong way, thank you. Operational specifications, can we scroll down again? Definitions, that's part 2, and again, and again. Here we find part 3, table of contents, and there are, on the page we're looking at, 8 sections, including operations, maintenance of security and safety, admissions and discharge, section 4 isn't used, escorting, healthcare, catering, welfare and regime. And if we can scroll down and to the top of the page. Next page, religion and race relations, communication, requests and complaints. Section 12, use of force, removal from association and temporary confinement. Health and safety arrangements, provision for detainees at risk, that's section 14. Contingency planning arrangements, fire prevention measures, establishment cleaning, border and immigration manager and independent monitoring board, staffing, and then I think section 20 is the last, no it's not the last, personnel, IT systems and audit, 22 sections in all. So we've got 2 pages of contents. Schedule D runs to 226 pages. And let me give you one example of one of the sections within Schedule D. Can we go to page 147, please? And this is provision for detainees at risk. The contractor shall maintain order, control and discipline and a safe environment in the removal centre. Staff will identify and provide care and support to those detainees at risk of suicide or self-harm, and then the contractor shall minimise the risk of a detainee harming themselves. As a minimum, the contractor shall ensure that ACDT training is provided for all staff, etc. Detainees at risk are identified. There is an ACDT committee that will meet as required or at least monthly. Was there an ACDT committee?
The honest answer is I can't say definitively.
No.
I would expect there to be yes.
I don't think we've ever heard of one, you see, Mr. Peppery.
I can't respond to that.
So if that's what the contract required and there wasn't one, then that was presumably in breach of that part of Schedule D.
Yes,
Yeah.
logically.
Measures are established which ensure active engagement with detainees rather than passive monitoring. What does that mean?
Well, my expectation is that there is interaction between our staff and the people that they are caring for. That becomes even more important when someone is on an ACDT or ACCT plan in prisons.
Right. And the next bullet point, emergency first aid kits containing specified equipment are accessible and appropriately maintained. Links with the Samaritans are developed. Were links with the Samaritans developed?
That's my understanding, yes.
At Brook House.
That's my understanding.
And the next page, operate and manage an anti-self-harm strategy. Did you at Brook
There
House?
was a self-harm strategy at all of the establishments.
Operate and manage an anti-bullying strategy that provides support to victims and requires bullies to address their antisocial behaviour. What was the strategy that required bullies to address their antisocial behaviour? Do you know?
Well, it would be interaction with the bullies, talking to them, monitoring them. Easier, I have to say, in prisons than in detention centres.
Well, who did it at Brook House?
Well, my expectation would be one of the senior management team.
No, I know that's your expectation, but who did it?
I can't say here and now.
All right, and let's just have a look at the next page in case there's any more to this. Identify those detainees with special needs and then risk assess them on a regular basis and ensure that any precautionary arrangements are made to minimise the risk to the detainee, other detainees and staff. Was that done?
My expectation is it would be.
And ensure that there are arrangements in place to care for the needs of others in the removal centre affected by suicide or self-harm, which would include roommates.
Sorry?
Which would include roommates of somebody who'd attempted
Roommates, it would include other detainees, it would include staff.
Exactly. And were there arrangements in place?
There was a care team.
There was a
Care team.
And who was that?
Oh, gosh. Again, at this distance, I can't give you definitive names, but it would normally include a chaplain and some other people.
Do you agree that in order for G4S to be penalty pointed for self-harm resulting in injury, the criteria, which included physical injury resulting from the act and involving any failure to follow lay-down procedures for the safety of detainees, as set out in this schedule, was a high bar?
It would have been a high bar, yes.
So when, for example, we see self-harm resulting in injury, and we've got quite a few examples of those, as you would expect. And in order to save time, I'm not going to show them to you, Mr. Petherick, unless you wish me to do so. But we have, for example, examples of D1527 on the 25th of April, who tied a ligature to his neck and ended up with some injuries. And we have another detainee within our relevant period, D1914, on the 27th of May, forgive me, on the 5th of July, who had injured himself quite severely, resulting in him going to hospital, and he was put on ACDT. So we have, those are but two examples of self-harm resulting in some instances, quite serious injury. When there were such incidents, who sat down and went through 226 pages of Schedule D just to confirm that there was no failure to follow laid down procedures for the safety of detainees?
I doubt whether anybody sat down and went through 250 pages. My expectation is that the establishment management team at the right level and the Home Office came to a view on that.
And where would we see that recorded?
You'd have to ask them.
Well, I'm asking you.
Well, I don't know.
Why don't you know?
Because that is my expectation. Did I look at every case of self-harm across my estate? No, I didn't. Nor would I be expected to be quite honest.
Yeah. My question really is, Mr. Petherick, how does anybody, however it was done, decide that self-harm resulting in injury results in 400 penalty points without understanding what laid down procedure they had to be in breach of in order for the penalty point to be awarded?
I think, to be quite honest, you'd have to ask the people who were having that conversation.
Well, should I be asking Ben Saunders, for example?
As the director of the establishment, I would expect that.
But as far as you're concerned, you can't help.
Not on the finite detail of the individual conversations, no, I can't.
No. But whoever was doing it had to look at all of the facts of each self-harm incident, consider if it resulted in any physical injury, and at the same time, and more complicatedly, consider whether it involved any failure to follow laid down procedures for the safety of detainees as set out in Schedule D.
As per the contract, yes.
Yeah.
But in reality, it would be about what was the specific event and the immediate causation of that event. And so I doubt very much that people went to 250 pages.
226.
Sorry,
but,
my apologies.
No, but well, whether anybody ever went back to Schedule D at all is another matter entirely. But they ought to have done, or at least to have satisfied themselves that, as you say, any part of the lead up to an incident or any part of the causation of the incident was itself a failure in procedure.
Yeah. I think also we should understand that Moore Stevens conducted an audit of the incident reporting, and as I recall, didn't advance any of those concerns. I could be wrong in that, but that's my recollection.
Well, you're right, except if you want to look at the NAO report, which is INQ 000010 at page 35. It's not 10, it's 11. 11. And can we go to page 35, where I hope we'll find figure 14? If we just expand this and go to the top, findings of March 2018 financial review by Moore Stevens. This is what you're referring to.
Yes.
And if we look against penalties, and I think this is what you have in mind, the review did not identify any material errors in the handling of penalties for underperformance, but noted two issues. A lack of availability of evidence on why potential breaches recorded in the Home Office issues log were not reported in the monthly performance report, so there was an issue about non-reporting, and a lack of information on incident reports and therefore potential performance breaches and financial penalties, albeit the second point did not relate to Brook House. So it wasn't an entirely clean bill of health, and I can't tell you, and I'm not sure whether you know, Mr. Petherick, what it was they actually relied upon or examined. But the fact remains that there were clearly incidents of self-harm resulting in physical injury, none of which you'll accept resulted in any points being awarded during the relevant period. Do you understand, or do you appreciate that during the relevant period we're dealing with, there were 60 acts of self-harm in that 5-month period? Did you appreciate that?
Yes.
Yeah. And let me just put up on screen just one example of a monthly performance report so everyone can see what I'm talking about and what you're talking about. CJS 004580. And this is a removal centre monthly report, and we have all of these now for April, May, June, July and August. And Chair, I would like to have adduced in evidence, if it's not clear, we don't need to put them up, Zainab, but this in full, CJS 000479, CJS 004586, CJS 004581 and CJS 004585. They are respectively June through to August, the same type of document. This one we have on screen is for the month ending April 2017. And we can see it sets out a number of statistics, but in the second table on the page, this really deals with all the points, doesn't it, Mr. Petherick? Have you ever seen one of these?
I've seen them. I didn't get them automatically.
And if we go down to the next page, information including, we can see the 600, that's in red, that indicates points awarded for a particular failure, and the N on the right-hand side, if we can just go back to the first page, Zainab, mitigation accepted. And so what would happen is G4S self-reported a failure. That would attract a certain number of penalty points, and they would go cap in hand to the Home Office and say, well, this is our excuse, this is our mitigation.
I don't accept the cap in hand comment. There would be a discussion.
A discussion, all right. But the idea was to reduce financial penalties.
There was a discussion about whether the penalty was correct or incorrect, and yes.
Right. And if we go to the next page, under 3, untoward events, and you'll remember we saw that terminology in Schedule G of the contract. And if we go to the next page, at the top, C, self-harm resulting in injury, I'm tempted to say nil point, but it's no points as far as this is concerned. And the same applies for every one of the performance reports, Mr. Petherick, that we have for the whole of the relevant period as you've accepted. Can we look at another document? IMB 000047. This is a combined report to the Independent Monitoring Board. It's dated July 2017 for Brook House. Did you see any of these documents?
No, not automatically.
And it provides a number of data in relation to Brook House for July 2017. If we go to the next page, please. Under 1.4, number of acts of self-harm, 14 by 11 individuals. Intervention by resuscitation was not required for any of these incidents. Requiring off-site medical treatment, 1, treated on site, 2, refused medical treatment, 3. and it says in F123, reports of injury to detainee, forms not received 9. I think that should be an F213. Report of injury to detainee, forms not received. So here we have the IMB's report of self-harm, certainly resulting in physical injury by the look of it, in respect of 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 of the individuals, albeit 2 refused medical treatment, and healthcare provision, as I recall it, under Schedule D was also required, healthcare intervention. Do you think there was a flaw in the contract? Do you think there was a flaw, an omission in the contract which made it too difficult for G4S to, as it were, have to suffer financial penalty where detainees self-harmed, suffering physical injury? Do you think that was a flaw, that it was too low down, as it were, the pecking order of failures for which G4S would be penalised when it was made so difficult for a penalty to be imposed?
You see, I don't see that it is so difficult, because my expectation is that the operator and the customer, the Home Office, the representatives of such, would come together, would discuss, and where we were at fault, I would expect to pay those penalty points, because that's where you take the learning from.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually very important. I think the whole area of assigning targets to areas of self-harm can be fraught with all kinds of difficulties and dangers. Yeah. I think that's, the fact is, self-harm is a hugely important issue. You know that, I know that. And anyone who suggests otherwise, I have no patience with. And this again was one of the causal factors behind Peter Needham setting up the forum whereby we could learn from incidents of self-harm across the company internationally.
Yeah, but don't you agree, when we have these kind of figures, and this is just for July, and as I told you, there were 60 incidents of self-harm over a 5-month period during the relevant period for this inquiry. In order for G4S to be penalised for such failures, as I suggested to you earlier, the bar was set far too high, wasn't it? In other words, from a commercial point of view, from a contractual point of view, self-harm by a detainee just wasn't important enough.
Oh, no, let me really come back very strongly there, because I know from having to go to cells in prisons where a tragedy has happened, the impact on myself and other people, and going out as a governor, as an area manager, to inform the next of kin about a tragedy that's happened. No one can ever say to me that I or anyone I would expect to treat it lightly or anything else. It was very important, and that's reinforced by Peter Needham's introduction of that forum. So please, no one should suggest to me ever that I treated self-harm as being a factor that wasn't terribly important. I refute that entirely.
I'm talking here, Mr. Petherick, about the contract. The contract didn't treat it importantly enough.
The contract has to be operated by individuals, and it's, to a degree, up to the individuals and the discussions to test against the contract whether the failure happened or didn't happen as per the contract. So,
yeah,
the penalties are there. I can't say why they weren't operated, because I wasn't party to those discussions.
I mean, coming back to the issue I raised with you a few minutes ago about the terms of Schedule G in reliance on failures under Schedule D, if the centre director wasn't going through the schedule to determine if there'd been any failures in the lead up to an incident of self-harm, and if the Home Office wasn't doing it, then it wasn't being done properly, was it?
I can't speak for them. I think it would be improper to speak for them because I wasn't party to those conversations.
I mean, do you think the Home Office would realistically have scrutinised the information or reconciled it against the monthly performance management reports?
I would expect that, yes.
You would expect it. Do you think the inquiry can be confident that an incident of self-harm was not properly reported for the purposes of the contract and triggered a points award when it ought to have been?
Well, I think my reading of this is that the incidents of self-harm were reported. As I've just said,
Yeah.
I can't speak for others who were involved in the subsequent discussions. The fact is that the document on the screen is actually a joint G4S Home Office document to the IMB meeting.
So you're saying they were alive to these incidents of self-harm?
Well, I take it from the document being a joint document, yes.
Yeah. They were alive to incidents of self-harm, and if they didn't regard it as a contract breach, then there's not an issue.
Well, that's for the discussions, as I say, that the two parties at site would have had. I can't speak for those discussions.
Let's go back to Schedule G, please. HOM 000921 at page 9. Perhaps at the bottom of page 7 or 8, I think it may be. It should be 4.4 at the bottom. Is the next page. We have under the heading performance. No, it's my fault. It's the previous page, sorry. It should be page 8. Thank you. Right at the bottom, 3, significant performance failures. And there is some blurb about that. Without prejudice to the foregoing paragraphs, deduction shall also be made from, and we can read the rest, for significant performance failures which are listed over leaf. And so if we go to the next page, in that table, we have self-harm resulting in death, being any known incident of deliberate self-harm resulting in death which involves any failure to follow laid down procedures, £10,000 per incident. And if we go to the next but one box, in the event of a detainee escaping from lawful custody, A, from the removal centre, and being no longer within the custody of the contractor, or B, whilst being escorted outside the removal centre and being no longer in the custody of the contractor, the detention escape or an escort escape, for any period exceeding 15 minutes or less than 15 minutes if a further offence is committed, the contractor shall be liable to make a payment to the authority of £30,000 per detainee incident in respect of a detention escape, or £10,000 per incident in respect of an escort escape, in each case regardless of the number of detainees who have escaped. Do you think it's got its priorities wrong?
I think that's a question that should be directed to the Home Office who set the contract.
Or did it ever strike you when you were dealing with this contract, Mr. Petherick? Because you mentioned an escape on day one of Mr. Hannaford's tenure. And I assume that cost the company £30,000.
It did.
So did it ever occur to you when you were in post that the priorities are wrong in this table?
As a human being, I would say yes.
As the Managing Director of G4S Custodian and
I
Detention
think I'm
Services?
still a human being, and I would still say yes.
Yeah. No, well, as you made the distinction. And I'm asking you as your erstwhile
Yeah.
position as Managing Director of a company, not just as a human being, Mr. Petherick. Was that ever raised?
No.
Why do you think?
Probably once we were in operation, I mean, it may have been raised at the time. I doubt very much whether it was before the contract was signed. It simply didn't come into the conversation.
Yeah. It almost lends itself, don't you think, to the suggestion that the contract gives the appearance of the welfare of detainees being of less contractual importance than keeping them locked up.
No, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Not necessarily.
No.
All right. The optics aren't very good, though, are they?
No, I would accept that.
Yeah. Now let me turn away from the contract, please, Mr. Petherick, and move on to other matters. Ben Saunders, he was appointed as the Centre Director
Yes.
about 2012.
Yes, I'm sure that's right.
Oh, well, this is my understanding of his career. He was a social worker by training. He joined Medway STC in 2002, worked there till 2012 when he became Centre Director of Brook House.
I think he was Centre Director at Medway in between. He didn't join as Centre Director at Medway. He became Centre Director, I think.
Well, I said Centre Director of Brook House.
But
no,
he was
but-
also at Medway as Centre Director.
Yeah,
at
yeah.
some
Let's
stage.
rewind. He joined Medway in 2002. He joined Brook House in 2012. At some point, he was Centre Director at Medway, or was
That's my understanding,
Yeah.
yes.
But then
For
he
about 5 years, as I recall.
right. And he joins Brook House as Centre Director in 2012. On the 11th of January of 2016, the BBC Panorama programme exposes the problems at Medway. And around that time, you dispatch him back to Medway from Brook House.
I think it's wrong to say I dispatched him.
Who did?
There was a request from the Managing Director of the G4S Children's Services business stream after he had had discussions with, I assume, the Youth Custody Service in MOJ about needing an interregnum director at Medway,
Yeah.
and I was asked to broker that request with the Home Office.
And so he was sent back for about, 6 months or so?
About 6 months, I think.
And then he returned to Brook House in the early summer of 2016.
Yes.
He says in his witness statement he was sent back to Medway to provide leadership and stability.
That's correct.
Does that sound about right?
Yep.
To you, as you understood it? Now let's rewind all the way back then to 2012 with all of that in mind. He told Verita that Brook House was a step up for him. Does that sound about right
Yes,
to you?
it does.
Why would that sound right to you? Why would it be a step up for
It
him?
was a larger centre. It was a different operating environment, but primarily, I think the larger centre with the greater accountability.
Well, he'd come from a secured training centre. Why was there greater accountability?
Well, through the sheer size of the centre.
He said, and if needs be, again, this can go up on screen, but in his interview to Verita, he said, I'd become very target-focused, contractually compliant-focused manager and leader, and actually that is not the person I am. I'm very people focused, and I found that refreshing, and I reflected on that and incorporated some of that change into our discussions and conversations and how I would behave in my work. And he was asked a little later, therefore your evidence is quite clearly that the focus seemed to be on targets and profit. People talked about people, but in reality the focus was on profit. He said, yes, I wouldn't say that necessarily of Jerry, but it felt like that above, and certainly there was pressure around delivery, absolutely. And then he was asked, however, you felt through them, did you, this sort of pressure for delivery? No, not just that. There was pressure for delivery from Jerry. It's right, you should deliver. So those were the pressures he talked about. Do you accept those pressures that he felt?
Yes.
Yeah. So delivery, that it was target focused, profit element.
I don't necessarily accept the profit element intimation that you give. The fact is that we're target driven. I'm target driven, or I was when I was employed, and we had requirements on us to deliver. I see that as quite proper. I've seen that, as I've said previously today, in both my public sector days and my private sector days. I don't see any difference in that. As a governor, I had targets to deliver. As an area manager, I did.
There's nothing wrong with it, Mr. Petherick, as long as it doesn't interfere with the overarching welfare of those that you have
I agree,
to accommodate.
I agree, and I don't believe that they did, because, I see that, and I believe the vast majority of the people I worked with saw that as well. This is a vocation as much as anything else.
Well, maybe for you, but do you
Absolutely
think for everybody?
Again, I'd be naive to say that, but for me, absolutely and clearly.
Can we look at what you said in your Verita interview, VER 000263 at page 19? And at 346, you're talking about Michelle Brown. Well, no, it was a
it
different
isn't Michelle Brown. It was actually another lady.
Yep, which is what you say. We were left with that position. We advertised, the competition narrowed down to 2 people for the in-charge, because I was going to do the in-charge first and then trickle down from there for obvious reasons, narrowing down to Ben Saunders and Duncan Partridge. And I think what you're talking about here is the decision that was made about who was going to be centre director.
Correct, because to make sure we understand the context, my predecessor who was responsible for immigration services left to join another company. Appallingly, he then took the top 3 people from Brook House with him.
Ben coming from Children's Services, Duncan coming from a role in the Home Office Immigration. It was a close-run thing. Ben had it on merit. I thought I was getting an experienced director because he was director of Medway Secure Training Centre. I was wrong in that. What I had was an experienced enactor of his then managing director's instructions, and you were the MD. Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer. Were you also the COO, the Chief Op? Who was
No,
it?
let me be clear. His Len MD's instructions, that was the MD of Children's Services, because Medway was in a separate business division to mine.
So you were talking about Medway, his Medway time. Let's put it this way. My philosophy is that it is a director's job to manage the centre. In the children's services world at that time, that wasn't the philosophy, and so I didn't have what I was quite anticipating. I think that's life. So just going back, it was a close-run thing.
Yeah.
Ben had it on merit. I thought I was getting an experienced director because he was director of Medway. I was wrong in that. Were you telling Verita that you'd made a mistake in picking him?
No, I wasn't making that in any way, shape or form. I was saying that Ben wasn't as experienced in directing as I would see it, as I thought he would be. He had absolutely the right personal qualities in my view, in terms of care for individuals. I learnt through the passage of time, and this was probably the first intimation of that the then MD of Children's Services was a much more controlling person in his estate than I was. My belief is very much that directors get paid to direct their establishment in the same way as in the public sector, governors get paid to govern their establishments.
So he wasn't the wrong person. He was the right person, but just with the wrong experience.
He had a different experience to what I had anticipated, but he was of the competition, and it was a competition. He was the person who won out on merit.
Duncan Partridge, you say we thought was someone for the future, and he didn't get the director's job, but we did appoint him as deputy director. We had a long conversation with him about, can you handle this? We were satisfied by the assurances, but the chemistry was wrong. So that was what the chemistry he gave you, Duncan Partridge.
Yeah, well, not just him to me, but the chemistry between him and Ben. We had two people competing for the role.
Yeah.
We had someone experienced, as I saw it, in managing and directing an establishment. We had someone else who had experience of the Home Office immigration, which I thought was useful, and I thought the combination was the correct combination. We tested out because we were aware how people who have an ambition to go for one post don't get it and then get the number 2 post. That can be difficult.
Yeah.
And so we tested that out as best we could. We got assurances. I'm not sure that the assurances were as deeply meant as they were said.
And if we run on to the next page, and you say chemistry was wrong, Duncan and I believe went out to trip Ben up. Ben was having pressures from me because of a number of things. He was having pressure from Duncan. It ended in tears. Duncan left. That undoubtedly caused some instability. My take on Ben, you say you want it honestly, so I'll give it to you honestly. He's a really good schmoozer of people. He's a nice guy. I have a lot of time for Ben. We learnt through time. He always wanted to be considered well, felt well by everyone, and he would actually work in that way. I'm afraid every director needs a sword. If it's in the scabbard all the time, it's no good. If it's out all the time, it soon gets blunt, and you need to find the balance. Ben is a very good schmoozer, a very good interactor. He didn't like the confrontation with some of his staff, particularly senior managers. We had a number of complaints and grievances from senior staff towards that. People will probably say nothing happened. That's absolutely wrong, because Ben was challenged in an appropriate way and given guidance, given challenge. People won't necessarily have seen that, and nor should they. So what were you saying there about swords and scabbards?
I know only too well from my personal experience of managing establishments that you need to have a number of skills, one of which is knowing when to be very forceful, very directive, and to challenge people. And sometimes people don't like that. So it's my perhaps lazy way of saying I needed and I need to be able to handle some very direct conversations and directions. So people can criticise my language. I'm quite happy with that, but that's my intent.
Looking back now, did he meet your expectations, Mr. Petherick, as a centre director, or did he disappoint?
No, in many ways he met them. He met them certainly for, as I saw it, for decency. In my experience with the director and deputy director, governor, deputy governor in public sector, you look for a balance. You look for someone who's good at stakeholder management, and you look for someone who's really leading the tactical day-by-day stuff. Ben's particular expertise is that of stakeholder management, and I would expect then the deputy to be dealing with the more tactical, and that's generally how it works.
Yeah, well, you know what? That's exactly what he says, that he looked outwards.
Yeah.
he was more busy with the external stakeholders than looking inside. Do you think that's what you really needed in a centre director? Somebody who perhaps was more interested in keeping the Home Office happy and the other external stakeholders?
I think you need a balance, and I've had that balance personally in the past, that you do need a balance as a governor, and that's a direct comparison.
Well, who provides the balance? He does, or other people under him?
I look at it as a team. So the balance, as director, you need to have a balance between stakeholder management and being aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
But most of the tactical management of the establishment would be the responsibility of the deputy director.
Were you aware of the sort of challenges he was subject to by other members of the SMT?
I picked up increasingly those challenges.
Yeah. I mean, Steve Skitt, who I reminded you earlier, joined Brook House in 2015, as I remember, to go along and himself help with stability.
Indeed.
Called is a place where there was, and this is what he told us on Thursday when he gave evidence, that it was a long established grievance culture.
Indeed.
Why?
I think a number of factors are relevant there. In my experience, smaller establishments tend to be more difficult in those terms of relationships. I'm not sure why, but that's my experience. I think the fact that when my predecessor as MD took out the top 3 layers of management from Brook House when he left, that caused an atmosphere which ranged from why wasn't I also invited to go, to people having hopes about fairly accelerated promotion and issues such as that. I think there are a number of factors that were involved.
Yeah. I mean, Steve Skitt told us he hadn't seen anything like it in 30 years.
Yeah.
And Lee Hanford, who you brought in, I think, in about 2016 to help sort it all out, said he'd not seen anything like it in 31 years in the custodial environment. Bit of a concern, isn't it?
Yes, it was. And that's why we reacted to it.
How did you react to it?
By becoming personally involved with giving advice and guidance, by putting in the additional resource of Steve Skitt to give some more resource, hopefully to give Ben Saunders some support, and to give me another set of eyes and ears.
In order to save time, Mr. Petherick, I can't go through all of the fine detail of all of the grievances, but you'll know it involved Duncan Partridge, who left, Nathan Ward, who left. It got to the point where you yourself, at very short notice, had to go down to Gatwick and, as it were, knock heads together. You spoke to Ben Saunders on the 28th of October 2015. You also spoke to Duncan Partridge. You talked about, in a note that you wrote, which we have, his clumsy managerial style. Do you remember that?
I said, I think I saw 2 examples of clumsy handling where he didn't maximise the benefits that he could have accrued.
Yeah, and for the record, that's VER 000103, which I asked to go in full. And there was something about a hit list he had, a hit list of what people he wanted to get rid of? Or
There
what?
was that rumour, yes.
A rumour, but you didn't believe it, I think.
Well, Ben argued against that.
Yeah. But there'd been a rumour going around he had some hit list, and you quizzed him about that.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And in fact, Nathan Ward speaks about it in the witness statement to which I referred earlier, which should be adduced in full if it isn't already, Chair DL 0000154. And then we have the Medway report, of course. Were you familiar with its terms?
Not in any great depth, because it wasn't in my business.
But it was your business, surely, to understand its content and the impact it might have on Brook House, for example.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And if you read it, and we can go through it if needs be, but and it's a report again which I'm sure this inquiry and the chair is interested in, INQ 000010. It spoke of a culture being based on control and contract compliance, blurred lines. I know this was not your baby, as it were, because it was somebody else who was running it within the company, but blurred lines of accountability, concerns about the organisation supposed to be scrutinising or safeguarding, that there'd been a history of similar concerns being raised repeatedly in letters from whistleblowers and former staff, that use of force had been disproportionate and punitive, and that there was a lack of understanding of causes and drivers of behavioural problems and too much focus on controlling the behaviour of individuals rather than on dealing with underlying vulnerabilities. And so if one reads it, it rather chimes with a number of the issues this inquiry is inquiring into. Do you agree?
Yes.
And those concerns were shared by Peter Needham, because in the report, which was put up by Zainab a little earlier, only because I'd announced one digit out what the actual URN was to it, that he is quoted in the report at paragraph 2.17, Peter Needham, saying there was a need to encourage a change of culture and for people to be able to openly raise their concerns. Did Peter Needham discuss with you the Medway report? I mean, was it a topic of conversation?
Yes, that was both on a one-to-one basis, but also in Peter's MD's meeting, as I recall.
And did G4S at any level, whether at your level, his level, because you say he was your line manager, or at any other level, did anybody say that we need to sit down with this report and see if these problems apply elsewhere within the institutions we're running?
My recollection is that, and I think understandably, that would have been left to individual MDs, so for example to myself, and that was my recollection. I'm trying to recall, because at one stage the company went into a very widespread creating conscious leaders exercise with a lot of significant training input to us, that I think that was at a different period.
So, looking back now, Mr. Petherick, can you remember whether you or the company at large were caused by the content of the Medway report to look across at all the custodial institutions G4S ran in order to ensure that the same problems could not or were not arising in those establishments?
I would say that was an ongoing and relatively normal part of my work, because you go back to issues such as the Milgram experiments, etc., which we learned from years ago, and I always have to be aware of the risk of that, and I take reassurance from a number of features, be it my own visits to establishments when I would walk around, be it the inspectorate, the IMB, and so forth. I take soundings from a number of different inputs.
Which all leads really to the question, how was it, do you think, that the kind of behaviour that we witness on Panorama was missed by those in management?
I wish I could give you a simple answer to that. I can't. And I think, and I do come back to this being a particular challenge in all custodial type environments, because some people can be very good at hiding such behaviours and their abhorrent behaviours and so forth. And from a personal point of view, I used to give myself as much assurance as I could by walking around my establishment at all kinds of times of day and so forth. Other people will get assurance in different ways. I know when I visited Brook House or any other of my establishments, I would make a point of walking around and feeling the atmosphere. But you know and I know that people who misbehave will hide it from people such as myself as I walk around.
Well, first of all, first question, how often, realistically, Mr. Petherick, did you walk around Brook House during let's just pick on the relevant period,
Yeah.
April through to August 2017. How often did you actually go down there?
Ideally, I'd have gone there about every 6 weeks,
Yeah.
but during that period, and it was 2017, wasn't it? The fact is that most of my efforts and interests were being directed towards HMP Birmingham
Yeah.
in
Well,
the aftermath of
yeah.
a disturbance there.
Well, you said as much in a different context in an investigation interview with G4S, I think, in October 2017, because you were being asked about how
Indeed.
the reason why certain grievances you couldn't deal
Indeed.
with. And you said because you had to deal with the Birmingham issue, which was December 2016.
Yes.
And so the same thing. So for one reason or another, you weren't able to make the visits you might otherwise, as you put it, ideally visit. But we understand what you say, that if a senior man or a senior woman for that matter is walking around, DCOs and DCMs aren't going to misbehave in front of you under your nose. Well, they shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be.
The other point I'd like you to consider is it's not just one person hiding this. It's a number of people. And it's a number of people in the whole Brook House estate. And yet it's still being missed. You must have thought about this quite a bit. And how did we miss this? How did we not learn the lessons of Medway? Why didn't we look a little more closely? And what was the answer to all of that?
I can't give an absolute coherent answer because there are a number of levels, there are a number of organisations, but let's just talk directly about the on-site. I would have expected the signs to have been picked up, to have been acted on. I had other members of my team going in, the IMB, and I knew, as I've said in my statement, one of the IMB members was a former colleague governor, an experienced governor.
Was that Dick Webber?
Yes.
Mr. Webber.
And, you know, when Dick and I were on site, we would talk, obviously. And so there are a number of things that you just look back and have great difficulty in explaining.
In May 2017, you appointed a Chief Operating Officer, Paul Kempster.
Yep.
Why was that?
It was something that we had talked about, attempted to do previously, because I became very aware that I was not getting into establishment as much as I would want to. And so we agreed, we being Peter Need and myself, the company, to invest in this, to give more resilience into my operating division.
Was it designed to take some of the pressures off you, given you were focused on Birmingham at that point?
It wasn't just Birmingham, but obviously Birmingham was my major focal point. Yeah. It was a realisation that I was thinly spread, the resilience wasn't there, and also looking towards eventual succession planning.
Yeah. What, for Ben Saunders?
No, for myself.
Yourself? Was it in any way to keep an eye on Ben Saunders?
No, no more nor less than anywhere else.
And so we're clear, Mr. Kempster, was his job going to be just Brook House? Or?
No. His job was going to be across my estate. There was a period of time, given that he had left the public sector, where the terms of him leaving led to some restrictions.
Well, there were
on
quite a
his
few
activities.
restrictions. He mentions it in his Verita interview, which again could be adduced VER 000271, where in fact, although he was appointed at the beginning of May, the restrictions continued until November. He said, beginning of November.
That would be about right. It's normally a 6-month period.
Yeah, because of civil service restrictions. Yeah. And so, in effect, although he'd been appointed in early May, his usefulness on the ground was pretty limited, if not completely nugatory.
No, I wouldn't say completely nugatory. They were more limited than ideal, but that was an HMPPS restriction. When I left, as I recall, the restriction wasn't so onerous. It was just about not being able to become involved in bidding activity.
Yeah. Are you Mr. Petherick prepared to accept that as Managing Director of G4S Custodial and Detention Services during the relevant period that you were personally responsible for the failures that we have seen?
If anyone is tough on me, there's no one tougher on me than myself.
Well, how tough are you going to be to this question, Mr. Petherick?
Yeah, ultimately, I was at the top of the pyramid.
Yeah. Because if you're not accountable, who else is?
Yeah. So, as I say, no one can yell at me more than I can yell at myself.
Chair, that's all I'm going to ask Mr. Petherick. Do you have any questions for him?
Thank you, Mr. Rotman. Thank you, Mr. Petherick. I do just one brief question, actually, possibly two, depending on your answer. You talked right at the beginning of your evidence around there not being a kind of necessarily a set formula for staff ratios, but you did talk about that some of the things that might impact on what in your experience is an appropriate ratio would be things such as the structure of the environment, the sight lines, those kind of things. So those more kind of permanent measures, perhaps. Is there also a degree to which that some of the more dynamic factors impact on the ratios? So, for example, in a high security prison, one might expect that the ratio would be different to in an open prison. Yeah. I'm correct in understanding that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In that case, is there any element through which the process of the vulnerability of the population also should impact that ratio? So if we're talking about the type of people that you have detained in a place who may have more need than in a different environment, should that ratio
Yes, it should.
Flex?
Yeah. I'm not aware of any set ratio, but those are some of the factors that should be involved in setting them.
So I want to ask you a question which is now with hindsight. Looking back, knowing that the profile of the type of person that was going to be cared for in Brook House was shifting for a number of reasons that you touched on yourself, so that there was going to be an increase of time served foreign national offenders coming into the estate who had previously been held in prisons, along with changes in the prison estate that were then impacting in IRC, so the use of spice is one of those that we've talked about. Do you think that sufficient thought was given to whether that ratio should have changed? Did it change enough?
With the clarity of hindsight, no, to both of those elements. And you look back and you think we should have been sharper about it because the impact was there. And so that's one of the regrets I have, the reflections I have, put whatever word you like to it.
Okay.
But I would certainly say we would have changed the approach.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then one final question, just in relation to, you also talked about your own experience and how one of the ways that you would provide assurance to yourself of what the culture is like in an establishment where you were a member of the SMT was to walk around. But you also said that there might be other ways that other people would have of doing it. Can you give me an example of how might somebody do that if they weren't walking around?
I think you could only do that by really close attention to the data. Ideally, it's a blend of the two. But from how I operate myself, I wanted to get personal assurance by looking for myself and appearing at the difficult times, potentially. And just standing, watching, I would call them kind of coffee cup conversations with staff and indeed detained people, just to have that conversation. And I would always go down to the CSUs, wherever I was visiting, and actually talk to the people there, both staff and the people in residence, because that's one of the real ways that I would get assurance for myself.
And when you say difficult times, can you give me an example of what you might mean?
When people are very busy,
okay.
Meal times, and we all know that meal times can be a flashpoint anyway. Ideally, you'd have a blend of the quiet times when you could sit and talk to people and at the busy times when they may be under more pressure. And so it's really trying to get the feel for the whole day. And that's why, as I was saying just now, I didn't get to Brook House often enough during this period, but for very obvious other reasons. And that's why we brought in the Chief Operating Officer.
Thank you. I
Thank
don't
you.
have any other questions. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Petherick. I know you've been with us for a long day. I do really appreciate your evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can I suggest we take our break now so that we can start the new witness after a break? It's almost quarter past, shall we say 3:30?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Petherick.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ms Townsend, thank you.
Just repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Chair, we'll now hear from Sarah Newland.
Thank you.
Miss Newland, please could you give your full name to the inquiry?
Sarah Louise Newland.
And you have provided a witness statement which has the URN number dated SER 0000458. Is
Yes.
that correct? Chair, may this be adduced into evidence?
Thank you indeed.
Miss Newland, I want to first ask you about your background to working at Brook House, which you deal with your in your witness statement in paragraphs 3 to 8. Your first job in this kind of environment was at Colnbrook IRC, so I understand, as a custody manager in 2004.
Yes.
Then in December 2007, you were operations manager on the overseas escorting contract for G4S.
Yes.
And this involved, was an office-based role,
Yes.
and you managed over 200 overseas escorts repatriating detained persons.
Yes.
Then in May 2011, you were head of CEDA's pre-departure accommodation, which we'll know as PDA,
Yes.
which housed children and families, which was run in collaboration with the Bernardo's charity.
Yes.
And then from October 2016, which is the period that we're most concerned with, because the relevant period obviously comes within that around 6 months later, you were head of Tinsley House, CEDA's PDA and the Borders Suite. And this, in terms of your responsibilities at Brook House, you undertook duty director
Yes.
responsibilities. Please could you just briefly explain what that actually meant?
Yeah, so the role of duty director was to be the senior manager responsible for the day-to-day running of the centre. I would do weekends approximately every 6 weeks and perhaps the odd day. So that meant checking that staff were in the right areas. There were some routine tasks that we had to do. We would check on ACDT documents. We would chair ACDT reviews for those individuals who were on constant supervision, chair all 40 reviews, visit the areas of the centre, talk to staff, etc.
And you said that you do that every 6 weeks, so there would be one shift that you would do that every 6 weeks. Is that
It was
right?
a weekend every 6 weeks.
A whole
'cause-
weekend?
Yes.
I
Yes.
see, so 2 days worth of...
Usually, yes.
And in July 2018, obviously after the relevant period, you then became Deputy Director of Gatwick IRCs on the PDA, and that's your present role.
I think my statement says I became the Deputy Director in July 19.
Apologies, July 19.
Yes.
And then... and that's meant that you were TUPE'd over from G4S to Serco when they took over the contract in May 2020.
That's correct, yes.
I want to firstly ask you, as a substantive topic, about the Jimmy Mubenga case. Mr. Mubenga died in October 2010
Yes.
after 3 G4S guards on a plane in Heathrow Airport restrained him in what the coroner found to be in an unlawful manner, and this was against the background of pervasive racism within G4S. In terms of your role at that time, you were G4S operations manager, responsible for overseas escorts team removing foreign nationals, and this was at the time of Mr. Mubenga's death in 2010.
Yes.
In your interview with an academic, Dominic Aitken, I won't bring this up, you've already had a chance to look at it. You said during that time you had a key role, your key role rather, was dealing with staff. I want to take you now briefly to the coroner's report. It's INQ 000176. And it's pages 16 to 17. And Chair, it's your bundle at tab 42.
Thank you.
Looking there at paragraph 39, this is the coroner's report into Mr Mubenga's death. The coroner says, following the death of Mr Mubenga, racist material was found on the private mobile phones of two DCOs who were responsible in the attempted removal of Mr Mubenga. These comprised numerous text messages, the contents of which were explicitly racist. Most of the text messages had been sent to the mobile phones of the DCOs concerned by third persons. However, some were forwarded to others by these DCOs. Further text messages were not deleted, notwithstanding their exceptionally offensive content. Some of the messages referred to immigrants, specifically. For example, one message read as follows: "Fuck off and go home, you freeloading, benefit-grabbing, kid-producing, violent, non-English speaking cocksuckers." And take your... Turn the page, please. Those hairy-faced, underwearing, bomb-making, goat-fucking, smelly rag-head bastards with you. And in the case of another DCO, another of the DCOs read, "Just been sacked from my new job on the wine and spirits section of Asda. A Muslim came in and asked me to recommend a good port. I said, Dover, now fuck off." The coroner said, paragraph 43, these texts were not evidence of a couple of rotten apples, but rather seemed to evidence a more pervasive racism within G4S. Evidence provided in the run-up to the inquest about the texts from one of the DCOs was the fact that lots of his work colleagues and acquaintances would send such material between themselves. Evidence at the hearing itself was that some of the texts were sent by other DCOs, that is, other than 3 involved in the incident resulting in Mr Mubenga's death. I'm sorry, Chair, I've just been told that there seems to be no signal on the live stream. Perhaps we could just pause for a moment.
No, yeah, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. We can take that down. Ms Newland, were you aware of the inquest findings, in particular in relation to the racism that was criticised within that report?
Certainly not at the time of Mr Mubenga's death. I don't know at what point those racist messages came to light. Mr Mubenga, as you say, died in October 2010. The contract transferred to Reliance in May, end of April of the following year. So I was only on the contract for another 6 months after that. But I was not aware of those messages at that time, no.
And were you aware of those kinds of racist attitudes that were held amongst G4 escorting staff, G4S escorting staff?
Not to the extent that is in the report, no. No, there may be isolated incidents brought to our attention. Certainly I can recall being involved in disciplinary investigations relating to inappropriate behaviour, some of which was picked up on recording devices in escort vehicles, but nothing of that nature.
When you say inappropriate behaviour, do you mean racist remarks such as the ones we've just seen?
I don't recall anything specifically racist, no.
What do you mean by inappropriate behaviour?
Swearing, unprofessional language.
So were you aware of any racist attitudes amongst staff?
No.
Were you aware of what steps were taken after this time by G4S in order to address what was described as pervasive racism within G4S?
No. You know, as I've said, following Mr Mubenga's death, I can't remember the timeline exactly at what point the inquest started, but I left the contracts fairly shortly after that, so I don't know specifically what was done by Reliance, as it would have been from April in relation to those issues.
So within those 6 months, was there any action taken at that point whilst you were still working there?
I don't recall. Like I say, I'm not sure at what point those messages came to light or were disclosed to whether it was G4S or then Reliance was responsible for those staff. But there was a lot of activity to demobilising the contract as well for handover, so it was a busy period.
So the coroner's report came out in July 2013. So obviously some time after that, although I don't know when exactly the racist messages came to light.
Yeah, so I was no longer on the contract at that point.
I want to bring up, please, on screen the witness statement of Nathan Ward. It's DL000141 and page 4, please, Zainab. It's tab 2, Chair. This is at paragraph 10. Around this time, G4S lost the immigration overseas escorting contract, and some of the escorting staff were transferred into Gatwick IRCs and pre-departure accommodation. Sarah Newland, the G4S operations manager, responsible for overseeing G4S's overseas escorts team for removing foreign nationals at the time of the death of Mubenga on the 12th of October 2010, was promoted in May 2011 to be head of Cedars. As far as I'm aware, there was no real formal appointment and interview process. Pausing there, do you know if there was a formal process in which you were appointed?
No, I recall a conversation with Andy Clark about the role, and I recall meeting Mr. Nathan Ward, but I don't know whether there are other candidates that they were considering.
And was it a formal interview that took place?
No, it wasn't. I do remember being asked to go and meet Mr. Ward at Tinsley House, which I did. It wasn't a formal interview, which I think is what I was expecting, but I participated as much as I could in the process.
I'll read on. This is Mr. Ward again. I was asked by Managing Director Andy Clark to have an informal conversation with her, so I took the opportunity to ask her about the death of Mr. Mubenga and whether she had any idea as to what had gone wrong. She told me that she was aware of a bad culture, but managers like her sat in an office and could not control what happened on the ground. I was taken aback at the lack of responsibility as an operations manager, but it presented as a typical attitude. Sarah Newland was promoted to head of Tinsley House in 2017 and has been a deputy director at Gatwick's IRCs since November 2019. She's continued in her role since Serco took over running the centre in May 2020. What do you say to that suggestion that you said that managers like you were sat in an office and couldn't be expected to control what happened on the ground? Did you say that to Mr. Ward?
I don't recall having that conversation with Mr. Ward. I deal with this in my statement. It's plausible that we did discuss the death of Mr. Mubenga because it was a relatively recent event at that time, but I don't recognise the attitude that he describes from me. The death of Mr. Mubenga was a shocking event for all of us that were there at the time, and for him to, I refute the fact that I was, quite dismissive of it as he describes.
Please can we turn to your Aitken interview, the one that we referred to earlier. Zainab, it's INQ 00078. That's page 1. And just if you scroll down, please, Zainab, under 7.10 escorting ? Under that heading, it says wasn't detainee facing, it was office job, 200 employees, quality assurance, which is difficult since remote working, lots of use of force, allegations of assault, viewing CCTV footage, coordination with professional standards unit. So you say there that it wasn't detainee facing, it was an office job.
Yes.
So that sounds quite like what Mr. Ward said, that you said to him, that it was an office-based type of job. Would you agree that that was likely then that you said something similar to that to Mr. Ward?
Like I said, it's possible we discussed Mr. Mubenga and my role, but I think, the point I'm making is he suggests that I was quite dismissive of what happened, and that's the bit I disagree with. He describes it as a typical attitude, and I didn't particularly work with Nathan Ward, so I'm not sure how he could just use the word typical.
What about because you were in an office job and you were a manager, you couldn't control what happened on the ground? Is that likely to be something that you said?
No, because there were elements of control. I think, I was not detainee facing. I didn't go out on the escorts, although, well, I did on occasion, but not routinely. But if things were brought to our attention, then they were dealt with, and that was through a number of means. Sometimes staff would report things anonymously, sometimes as part of a standard review of use of force that had occurred in a vehicle, we would pick up on things that were, that were not appropriate and would be dealt with. So I did take responsibility for things when they came to light.
Please could we go to page 4 of the same document? And I think it, on this version it may be just at the end of page 3. Yes, the third line down from the bottom paragraph, you say, I don't sit here and pretend to know what happened on the aircraft because I wasn't there. And there may have been different versions of events from different people who were involved. And I guess no one will ever know whether what they did caused his death or played a part in that. But I know on a personal level that marriages broke up, got into debt. It really did affect them, and that will stay with me in my career in managing those things. So having seen the worst outcome, I think just makes you focus a little more on things at times when people might not see it through the same eyes. I'll be like, no, we're doing this now. You've talked there a bit about responsibility. As manager of those frontline staff, what responsibility, if any, did you take in terms of what happened to Mr. Mubenga?
There had been some recognition within the overseas contract that control and restraint wasn't necessarily an appropriate way to restrain somebody on an aircraft. That had become increasingly sort of relevant during my tenure on that contract, to the point where G4S had commissioned one of its use of force instructors to start looking at how techniques could potentially be adapted for use on an aircraft. Unfortunately, Mr. Mubenga's death, this was prior to Mr. Mubenga's death, but those changes hadn't come in prior to Mr. Mubenga's death. After he died, there was a review of restraint techniques on an aircraft, which led to the current Holmes package, which is what overseas escorts use to restrain people for the purposes of removal.
But in terms of your responsibility, so my question was, as a manager of those staff, did you take any responsibility for what happened?
So I think in terms of reinforcing the need for a review of restraint, yes, I did take responsibility for that. The individual that was seconded by G4S to look at that reported to me, had raised his concerns to me. I had taken those concerns, to my line management within G4S with, some encouragement that we do something, sooner rather than later. But obviously any changes would require Home Office agreement as well. We hadn't got to that stage prior to Mr. Mubenga's death.
And so what you're saying now is these are things that took place after Mr. Mubenga's death in order to try and prevent it from happening again?
Yes.
Rather than things that may have been in place beforehand, or what you could have done beforehand?
The G4S review of restraint on aircraft and suggested amendments to techniques was taking place prior to Mr. Mubenga's death, but the introduction of the Holmes package, which is what came from that, was after his death.
And is there something you think that you could have done, even in some small part, as a senior manager, to have prevented Mr. Mubenga's death prior to him dying, rather than the steps that you took afterwards?
Well, we had taken those steps prior to his death in terms of the restraint. I just want to be clear on the timeline. So within G4S, we had tried to take some action on that prior to his death. It was afterwards that the Home Office commissioned HMPPS to do a full review, which is what led to the Holmes package. But G4S had started that work, and I was, part of the support team around that because, as I said, one of the instructors was part of my team. Those escorts on that particular job with Mr. Mubenga I had not had concerns raised with me about them prior to his death, certainly not in terms of some of the things we're discussing now. You know, like I said, if things of that nature did come to my attention, then they were dealt with. I did a lot of investigations on that contract, a lot of disciplinary hearings. So, you know, I did take responsibility when I was aware of things, but, you know, I was not there with that team with Mr. Mubenga on that day.
You've said what responsibility you've took afterwards, but now do you see yourself as having any responsibility for what happened?
Well, I don't know how I could have dealt with racist texts that didn't come to light until after. You know, like I said, if there were issues brought to our attention, then they were dealt with. But these, you know, these texts that are referred to here, they were not brought to our attention at the time. There was not an indication that somebody may have behaved in a particular way because of a racist attitude.
We'll come to that in a moment. In terms of G4S, you've said there at the top of page 4 that we've just looked at, that there were implications for officers' personal lives after this happened. And you also criticise on page 6, if we can go to page 6, please. As media's criticism of G4S on a personal level as insulting. You've described that the Medway panorama was demoralising to staff, and in your witness statement you've also criticised Callum Tully's decision to do undercover reporting at Brook House. Those incidents that we've just spoken about, Jimmy Mubenga's death, and also the Medway programme, and of course what happened to Brook House, of course they exposed serious abuse of people in G4S care. Ought that to have been a priority for you rather than the concerns about individual G4S's members of staff's personal lives, or the media criticism of G4S?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
So you've described Jimmy Mubenga's death's effect on the personal lives of officers, of the G4S officers, and you've also described the media reporting of G4S on a personal level as insulting. That's how you've described it. And that Medway, the Medway panorama programme was demoralising for staff. And you've also criticised Callum Tully in your witness statement for exposing, for his decision to do undercover reporting, rather than, say, coming to you, or not necessarily you, coming to senior management or so on.
Yeah.
My question is it more of a priority looking at G4S's reputation and so on than detainees' welfare?
No, I think there's quite a lot of comments that have been put together there that have said through, you know, what appears to be quite a lengthy interview. So I don't agree that those were my priorities. I think my criticism of Mr. Tully was not taking evidence of what he saw, if he didn't feel he could, to G4S than to the police at the time that those incidents were recorded by him.
Can we turn now to Emma Gin's witness statement, which is BHM 000041. And Emma Gin is the Director of Medical Justice. It's at tab 45 of the bundle, and it's pages 38 to 39, paragraphs 108D. Just over the page, please. D. The recognition that not only that she's talking about Jimmy Mubenga's death, and in particular she says the recognition that not only safer restraint techniques are needed, but that it is also necessary to ensure that DCOs act, quote, ethically and in a way that seeks to preserve the rights and dignities of the detainee, and the culture amongst DCOs is one in which detainees, I assume, are supposed to be there, are treated as individuals and their rights and dignities are respected, and where the use of force is seen absolutely as a last resort. She's talking in particular there about the Independent Advisory Panel on Non-Compliance Management, which I understand was headed by Stephen Shaw in 2014, and in response to Mr. Mubenga's death. Do you agree there that a value-based practice was necessary at that time after Jimmy Mubenga's death?
I think yes, and at all times, I completely agree with the statement that's made there, and that lots changed as a result of Mr. Mubenga's death and as a result of the Panorama documentary, and the level of governance and assurance around ethical behaviour is much more on this contract now with Serco than it was at the time. There are a lot more measures in place to ensure that doesn't happen.
And was this something that was raised by your managers at G4S after Jimmy Mubenga's death, aside from this Shaw report?
I don't recall.
And after Stephen Shaw's report and in particular this emphasis on values-based practice, particularly for use of force, what steps were then taken within G4S to ensure this value-based system?
Well, I'll go back to the fact the contract transfer happened fairly swiftly after the death of Mr. Mubenga. So although I was still employed by G4S, I was then across at the Cedars pre-departure accommodation. So I don't think I can comment particularly on this. I know what we did at Cedars PDA, but that wasn't Brook House and that wasn't overseas escorting.
I want to take you back again to your Aitken interview, please. It's INQ 000078. It's page 31. In fact, it's page 3. It should be the middle of the page. In fact, I don't think it's there, but if I can just read it out to you, I think that'll be quicker, if that's okay. You said in your Dominic Aitken interview, in respect of Mr. Mubenga, that there was, and I quote, an insinuation that there was a bit of a culture, but I think we try to eradicate that culture, but arguably you can only deal with an issue when it comes to light, and sometimes it was just a case of waiting until those issues came to light and you could deal with them. That's something that you've just said just now in respect to the racist tax and Mr. Mubenga. Did you accept the coroner's finding that there was evidence of pervasive racism?
Well, I can't argue with racist text messages that were found on the DCO's mobile phones, absolutely.
What about the statement that it was pervasive racism rather than just those two individuals?
Well, I assume that conclusion has come from the amount of people who were sharing those messages.
So did you accept that this was evidence of pervasive racism?
In the coroner's inquest, yeah, I'm not going to dispute that.
So is it your approach that only when issues have come to light that you have to deal with them, even when there are serious allegations of systemic racism and abuse? Do you have to wait for those issues to come to light before doing anything?
I think you can only deal with what you know or what people are able to provide you with evidence of.
Is it possible to have a more proactive approach in trying to ensure that there is that rights-based culture that we've just been speaking about?
Yes.
So that wait-and-see approach is perhaps not an appropriate one, especially after we've seen Jimmy Mubenga's death, Medway, and now what we've seen at Brook House.
Yes, although I go back to the point I was managing Tinsley House at the time of the relevant period, so I was there as duty director on occasion, as I've outlined in my statement, but my role was to manage Tinsley House.
Do you still adopt the same approach now as you manage both Tinsley House and Brook House?
approach as in...
A wait-and-see approach. Wait and see if
No,
evidence
look,
comes
that
to
was
light.
a comment I made, in an interview 5 years ago. I'm in a different role now. As I alluded to before, there is lots in place now, driven by Serco and mandated by the Home Office contract to ensure that staff are displaying ethical behaviour.
And in particular, it's important for senior management to behave in an ethical way, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Culture is driven from senior leaders, and the work that we're doing on positive detention culture at Gatwick has started with the SMT and is now being driven through the first line managers and the officers. I personally chair a monthly meeting with resident representatives at Brook House. We talk about staff culture and their experience of staff behaviour. That's an agenda item that I've personally added to that meeting to hear their views directly.
I'll come to that in just a second. In your witness statement at paragraph 138, you said that although I do not agree that senior management at Brook House during the relevant period have direct responsibility for what occurred, it would be unreasonable for me to state that senior management did not have partial, indirect responsibility. Culture within IRCs has to be driven by senior leaders. You go on in the following paragraph to say, you do not think it's fair to say that they, individuals, are the only ones responsible when holistically considering the environment culture at Brook House during the relevant period. Paragraph 140, you say how the atmosphere created an environment where unacceptable behaviour occurred. How would you describe that atmosphere or culture in 2017?
I think it was, Brook House could be a difficult place to work. It was, there were stressful days for staff. There were high rates of incidents. There were higher numbers of residents. They were more often than not quite frustrated with their situation. So I think, I deal in my statement with a number of what I see as contributory factors. The staffing levels, the rate of incidents, the fact that I felt that staff were often just running from one problem to another, firefighting, I suppose, and didn't always have time to reflect and try and understand what was driving behaviour. They were just dealing with it as it occurred.
And how would you describe that culture, the kind of culture now? You said that there are steps that have been taken by you in particular to improve staff culture. What has changed, if anything, since 2017?
So in terms of what I specifically do, along with chairing the meeting that I described earlier, I also quality assure any resident complaint responses that complain about staff behaviour, to make sure that I think we've been fair in our considerations. There's a section of the contract that deals specifically with healthy staff culture. So I'm part of a meeting bi-weekly with the Home Office where we consider resident complaints about staff on staff grievances, reasons given for leaving Serco if that's what people have elected to do, and also we track where there's been 3 or more uses of force in a rolling 3-month period per officer, and where that has been the case, then there's a trigger to look further into those circumstances to ascertain whether there's anything there that we need to be concerned about.
And would you say that the staff culture is driven by the senior managers?
Yes.
And how much responsibility did senior management have for the culture that allowed the mistreatment at Brook House, do you think?
I think there were not the same governance mechanisms in place there at that time. And I think the disciplinary outcomes from the meetings that I chaired post-Panorama indicate where staff have given what they felt were mitigating circumstances for some of the incidents, which were around staffing levels and how stressed they felt as a result of that
I want to now ask you about the senior management team and your relationships with individuals within it. As we've already mentioned, you attended Brook House every 6 weeks for SMT meeting. Sorry, every month, I understand, for SMT meetings.
Yes.
Physically attended Brook House, and then again every 6 weeks for your duty director
Yes.
role. In terms of your relationship and views of Ben Saunders, you have the centre director. You've said in your witness statement that Ben's style was more laissez-faire and consultative than you felt comfortable with. You said that I recall feeling frustrated during SMT meetings, the lack of decisive action and control of the more vocal members of the team. You also say that you believe Stacey Brown, Michelle Brown, Duncan Partridge filed grievances against him. In what way was he laissez-faire?
Ben liked a consensus of opinion on matters, and sometimes it's just not possible to reach a consensus, and I think it's fine to discuss and invite people's ideas, but there comes a point where there has to be some direction around what actions are going to be taken and who's going to be accountable for those actions, and for me that sometimes felt like it was lacking.
And were there any particular issues which you felt that he was lacking that decisive action on?
No, I think it was just a general theme of the meetings as I recall them.
So would you describe that as a lack of leadership?
Yes.
And in terms of Steve Skitt, you've said that you found him abrupt and indecisive, which meant that at SMT meetings there was little progress in some matters. Again, are you able to give any specific examples of what those particular matters might be?
Not that I can accurately recall. I just, as I say, I think I found those meetings frustrating in general, just because I felt there was a lot of talking and a lot of suggestion of who should do what, but I wasn't particularly clear of what the actions were coming out of that. Although, I would add that probably the majority of the issues related more to Brook House than Tinsley House at that time.
And you say that now you line manage Steve Skitt,
Yes.
and that you find that he seems to need clear direction.
Yeah, I think I had a view of Steve at the time when I didn't line manage him and I didn't work particularly close with him. But I think, Steve likes clear direction, and I think that was lacking for him, which, with hindsight, I can see why some of those behaviours were as I perceived them at the time.
And so Ben Saunders was his manager.
Yes.
So is it your view then that Ben Saunders wasn't providing the necessary clear management and clear direction that he needed?
Yes.
Michelle Brown, paragraph 24 of your statement, you said that she was domineering and tried to intimidate others. Who are you referring to there?
Specifically, I can recall Jules Williams, Dan Horton.
You also say that you challenged her on incorrect statements when others wouldn't. What kind of incorrect statements are you talking about there?
Michelle would sometimes sort of quote policies or procedures in support of her argument, which, on occasion I found to be inaccurate. But, I felt able to raise those inaccuracies with Michelle, but I think others didn't have the confidence to do so.
And what was her reaction when you did challenge her?
Michelle didn't really take kindly to challenge, so I think if she did accept it, it was perhaps begrudgingly.
Turning then to Lee Hanford, paragraph 26 of your statement, he took over as director when Ben Saunders left, and you said that there was a marked difference in the cohesiveness of the SMT and progress, and there became progress on long-term issues. Again, what were those long-term issues which progress was made on?
I'm not sure I can recall specific examples, but I think it just felt like we, Lee made decisions, Lee gave direction, Lee sought authority from the Home Office for things. It just felt like things moved forward at a pace that I hadn't experienced before. I also felt he had better control of the team. He was more directional, I suppose.
I won't bring it up on screen, but I just want to read out a very short remark from Ben Saunders' Reactive interview, which I know that you've seen. It's VER 000216, pages 12 to 14, paragraph 171. He said that there was quite a needy SMT. They needed a lot of support. They were quite sensitive. They all took their jobs really seriously. What do you say to that?
I wouldn't have used the words needy and sensitive to describe the SMT in broad terms. I think, some people did take their jobs seriously.
Were you one of those people?
Yes. But I think, needy and sensitive, no. I think, in my statement I've used different words. It certainly felt fractured. People didn't work as a team. There were some positive relationships among individuals, but that wasn't consistent across the team.
That leads us to what Lee Hanford told Verita and also told us Inquiry. He said that the culture within the SMT was toxic and compared it to Emmerdale. Would you agree with that statement?
I don't know what he means by the Emmerdale reference, but...
He said the culture was toxic, and I think what he meant by, or what he explained that he meant by it being like being on Emmerdale, was there was lots of infighting, lots of grievances
Right.
that were issued between different members of the SMT team, and it was essentially dysfunctional.
Yes.
Do you recognise that?
Yes, I recognise elements of what Lee has described, yes.
I want to ask you now about staffing levels. I don't think that's necessary to bring up on screen, but the Verita report, CGS 005923, page 77, found that there was continuing problems at Brook House resulting from a lack of senior management capacity and lack of staff to support them in fulfilling their roles. You said in your witness statement, paragraph 32, that this suggests that managers were too busy. You wouldn't say that in relation to Tinsley House, which you, of course, were managing at the time.
Yes.
But you were at the SMT meetings when this was discussed. Is that how you got an impression of that from working with colleagues, that they were, the senior managers there were just too busy?
Yes, there was a perception that was the case, although, as I've said, that wasn't my personal experience. And, I think on reflection there were periods where people were absent, lengthy periods of absence, which meant that the team was potentially running short at Brook House. People would leave post, and then there was a gap between them being replaced, which I imagine would play into that as well, from what I can recall.
In terms of perhaps lower down the tree in general, DCOs, DCMs and so on, you said in your Verita interview, again, there's no point bringing up, but at VER 00223, that there was insufficient staffing levels with a high turnover of staff who were inexperienced. I assume there you're talking about the relevant time in 2017.
Yes.
And you say at paragraph 34 of your statement that that concerns over high staff turnover were regularly raised, although this wasn't an issue again at Tinsley House.
No.
Can you remember what, if anything, was done once those concerns were raised at SMT meetings?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
You said at paragraph 36 of your statement that the concerns were particularly raised when Tinsley House was reopened, as staff at Tinsley House had been covering Brook House. And are you talking there specifically about the time when Tinsley House was refurbished? Or just in general, around that period?
Sorry, Tinsley House was closed to residents for a period of refurbishment from, as I recall, August, September 16 through to April, May 17. therefore, there was only a small number of staff required at Tinsley House for sort of site security measures. So the rest of the Tinsley team were deployed to work at Brook House over that period.
And was an increased number of staff ever raised by the director, by Ben Saunders, about the need for there to be increased levels of staff?
I don't know if it was raised by Ben. I know we shared concerns at the SMT about how the Brook House staff would feel when the Tinsley House staff reverted back to Tinsley House, but what Ben did with that information, I don't know.
And when the refurbishment stopped and the staff went back to Tinsley House,
Yeah.
were staffing levels maintained at Brook House during that time, after that time?
So the Tinsley House staff had been in addition to the Brook House staff. I think when Tinsley House reopened, Brook House reverted back to its sort of contractual staffing levels, but for the staff on the ground, they had had a period of extra support, particularly on the wings, that I think, was difficult for them to adjust to then going back to what was the contractual staffing level for Brook House.
And were there complaints made about the fact that they didn't have as much staff now that Tinsley House had gone over?
Yeah, I think they were certainly sharing concerns before the Tinsley House staff were going back to Tinsley House about how they would cope. But as I think I've said in my statement, it would have required a review of the contractual headcount at Brook House in order to enhance the staffing levels, and I'm not sure what was done about that, if anything.
I won't take you to it, but there's a SMT meeting minutes from the 11th of August 2017. It's CGS 000913, page 1, where Jules Williams, who was residential manager at the time, says staffing levels on the wings has been a struggle. SS, that's Steve Skitt, said that the detail fits, but escorts and constants had had an impact on staffing. MB, Michelle Brown, said the staffing is stretched and managers need to give more support. Do you recall Michelle Brown as saying that?
No, not specifically.
Do you agree that managers did need to give more support at that time?
I don't know what Michelle is alluding to with that comment. It's not particularly clear, so I can't offer any additional information on that.
You speak at the next SMT meeting on the 22nd of September. I'll read it out. It's at CGS 000918, page 2. The meetings record SNU spoke about issues with staffing levels, discussions around a new mentoring process for new staff with a SPOC, and that pairing up buddies needs to be done with good staff. DCMs are so busy managing detainees that they are not managing staff, which was mentioned in the recent staff forum. Staff need to deal with issues instead of telling detainees to see a white shirt. DCOs are not taking responsibility for managing simple things like running out of soap powder and not contacting stores. And in your Verita interview also, paragraph 105, VER 000223, you say that you were aware of issues whereby people were not being managed by their DCMs and didn't know who their DCM even was. And you don't think enough effort is made for DCMs to engage with staff. You also say this in your witness statement, paragraph 46. They spent too long on operational tasks rather than broader managerial responsibilities. Steve Skitt also raised this in an SMT meeting. You refer to it in your paragraph 147. You said there were regular employee development reviews and general performance reviews that were already in place. What exactly are you referring to there?
So G4S had they were called EDR, so Employee Development Reviews. So they were a biannual review and then an end-of-year performance review with a line manager. And I'm aware of those taking place, but I think there's a suggestion in those comments that are made in the SMT, and I'm not sure I made all of them. It may be the way it's recorded, that DCM should be spending more time supporting and mentoring staff. And I think, the comments I've made is that sometimes the operation was so fast-paced, there's such a lot going on that, you know, they were caught up in operational tasks and didn't have potentially the time and capacity to do that staff support element of the role.
So those EDRs, are you saying that they should have happened at the time, or is that something that happened after the relevant period in response to what happened?
No, they were in place during the relevant period.
And do you know if they actually ended up happening?
I wouldn't have had oversight of those submitted by Brook House managers, but I know they were taking place at Tinsley House, and I know there was an expectation that they would be done, so I can assume they were taking place at Brook House, but I can't be sure.
I want to ask you now in some more detail about the moving of the staff from Tinsley House to Brook House and the contract. If we can please turn to INQ 000174, paragraphs 23 to 25. This is the live transcript record of this hearing, and in particular Dan Horton, who gave evidence. If we look at, please, pages 23 to 25, and particularly 23, and it's internal page 92, so just scroll down, please. He says, in the question rather, it says, just halfway down line 16, I recall a decision made by Ben Saunders to run staffing levels below the typical headcount. This was prior to an upcoming contract renewal. The upcoming contract had a lower number of staff than levels at the time. Therefore, Ben took the decision to not recruit to our target number of staff, but wanted to keep staffing to contractual requirements on the basis that if G4S retained the contract, Brook House would not be over the headcount. The decision was financially beneficial as all savings increased the margin. If we just go to the next page, please, at the top. Can you help me understand this? Do you know when approximately? I know the bid process is quite long. The answer was yes, by Dan Horton. When was the contract renewal coming up? So it was renewal in 2018, yes. So I think a lot of the bid work had been done or was being done. I wasn't massively involved in it. I was made aware that a new bid that we were being asked to, or that we were bidding for, and other people were bidding for as much. The staffing levels were lower, and the level of educational services to residents, such as welfare, was lower. So that's, I think, where a lot of the staffing savings were. So instead of welfare being opened 7 days a week, it was only open 5 days a week, and so on. And then if we just look at the go on to scroll up, please, to page 94. Sorry, to 95, just at the top there. And that fluctuated based on headcounts. If the headcount at the centre was high and the number of hours that needed 24 were over 24 were higher, if it was lower, it was lower. So in fact, you could have your full headcount but still provide your contracted hours. And he goes on, this policy of running of staff numbers lower and the run up to the bid, is that an explicit policy by Ben Saunders, or was it more of an unspoken kind of gradual plan? The answer was, it was a discussion he had with me that he said he wanted me to maintain the contractual hours, but that he wasn't going to recruit the full headcount. Was the Home Office aware of that? I don't know. Have you ever had a conversation with him in the presence of anyone from Home Office about it? I don't recall that happening with the Home Office present, and so on. So there, Dan Horton is saying that he had a discussion with Ben Saunders just before the renewal bid in 2008, in order to essentially deliberately lower the number of staff in order to win the contract, so in order to make it look better, essentially. Was that something that you were aware of?
Not specifically in relation to contract renewal, but yes, I was aware of conversations around not recruiting to the full headcount, but maintaining the required staffing levels over a 24-hour period, which is essentially what Dan is saying here, yes.
You said in your Verita interview, and if we can bring that up, please, it's VER 000223. You can look at page 12, please. At 158. Miss Lampard says, tell me about the recruitment and retention issues at Brook House insofar as they have a knock-on effect at Tinsley. Let me just add a bit of colour to that. There's a suggestion from Jen Kench that in Ben Saunders' day, anyway, Ben would press John to take staff off Tinsley House to Brook House because the fine regime in relation to Tinsley House is less onerous than in relation to Brook House. You say, yes, that's true. And the question is, do you want me to explain some of that? Do you want to explain some of that? Answer, yes. Commercially, it is better to have staffing penalties at Tinsley because, frankly, it costs less. £100 at Tinsley is, I think, half to a third of what it would be at Brook. Then, if we can please go to paragraph 163, so just further down. So, in managing Brook House, which is what you do, how often do you find that you are, as it were, compromised or understaffed because you've had to service Brook House as well? You say it has been daily. Not now because we're in quarantine, so they're not allowed to cross-deploy, which is interesting because they seem to be coping without us. Is that something that happened often, that the staff at Tinsley House will be used at Brook House?
Yeah, I was particularly aware of this at the time because in managing Tinsley House, I was managing the Tinsley House staff who were feeling increasingly frustrated at being routinely deployed to Brook House. The two centres are different. It's not ideal for a number of reasons to have staff that are not based at a centre working at a centre because they're not as familiar with the resident population. They're not as familiar with some of the protocols. So the Tinsley House staff found it quite difficult to sort of, on a fairly ad hoc basis, have to work on, especially on the wings at Brook House. So they were quite vocal about it with me.
And in terms of the commercial benefit, you said in your witness statement, echoing what you've said in your Verita interview, here at 120, paragraph 128 of your witness statement, that it's difficult to say that a conscious decision was taken to deliberately understaff wings. If we can just go to, please, page 20 of the same document there, your Verita interview. It's paragraphs 276 to 277. Just scroll down, please, to 276. It's in the middle of the page there. The pressure would be that you might have a profile that's, say, 3, 4 and a wing and a DCM, but you might, in order to attain the profit, say, we'll run it at 2. That's the question. The answer, I know that was what Nathan Ward was accusing, and I did chuckle because I know that he was in the room when those discussions have happened in the past. To point the finger was a bit hypocritical, but it was factually accurate. Our biggest cost was as a people business, as a staff, and if you weren't employing them, then that. Therefore, in constructing the bid, there was no profit built in, and he said there is, but it is small. So you said there, but it is factually accurate. So are you saying there then, in order to attain profit, they did run the centre as understaffed, essentially?
I believe so, yes.
And as head of Tinsley House at the time, were you involved in this decision making?
No.
Even though it was the moving of Tinsley staff to Brook House that facilitated this?
Yes, it was. And I raised my concerns about that, and I raised my concerns about how that would potentially impact on our retention at Tinsley House, because I didn't think it was fair on the staff, and I didn't think it was an ideal way to operate Brook House either. But that it wasn't my decision to do that. I was just trying to manage the consequences of it at Tinsley.
Do you agree that this is a manipulation of the true staffing figures done by G4S in order to reduce the financial penalties?
Yes.
And do you know if the Home Office was aware that these figures were being manipulated in that way?
If I recall, the staffing measurement at the time was a set number of staff on duty over a 24-hour period. So provided that was being met, which you could do through cross-deployment or overtime, that was the level of the Home Office's sort of scrutiny around that, which, you know, isn't the case now. There are I think 3 separate key performance indicators on staffing in the current contract. One of them is as was with the correct number of staff over a 24-hour period, but there's also one around total headcount. So, you know, you're not able to do that now. The Home Office would see that.
You said that you raised concerns in relation to the difficulties of overstaffing, the more operational issues. But did you raise any concerns about the lawfulness or the ethics of there being a deliberate understaffing in terms of in order to make profits?
I don't recall anything specific. No, yes, I believe it was happening. I could see the impact of it at Tinsley House, but I didn't have conversations around it to the detail that Dan Horton did. He was managing staffing levels at the time, so across the 2 centres. So he would have had, you know, more of those conversations with Ben. It certainly felt to me like that was what happening, but I'm not sure how explicit the knowledge I had at the time was, if that makes sense.
You said that you could see what was happening and how it was affecting people on the ground. I assume that also, as you said in your witness statement at paragraph 125, that lower staffing impacted on the welfare and safety of staff and residents.
Yes, it could do, yes.
Do you think then that this is evidence of prioritising profit by G4S over detainee welfare?
Yes.
I want to now turn to Michelle Brown's witness statement, please. It's INQ 000164. It's page 52, paragraph 100. Just turn over the page, in fact just at the end of the page. She says, upon taking on the role of Business Intelligence Manager in 2009, I was pressured not to declare audit failings to the Home Office or wider G4S going back as far as 10 years, and that had historically been signed off as compliance. Michelle Brown describes being put under an untenable position, as I was not prepared to put my name to falsifying documents, which resulted in accusations from Sarah Newland, my line manager at the time, of not delivering in my role and being awkward. Did you put pressure on Michelle Brown in this way?
No, I don't know what Michelle is referring to here. The KPIs associated with audits at the time were to not complete them as per the schedule shared with the Home Office and not to address non-compliances within a certain period. There wasn't a penalty for having something that was non-compliance as long as you identified it and put a rectification plan in place for it. This is post-Panorama, and the Home Office had expanded their compliance team at the site. So we would submit a completed audit along with all of the evidence, and they would carry out their own quality assurance checks. So it would be fruitless trying to conceal something because they would want to satisfy themselves that all was as required. At this time, I am aware of some other issues that were impacting on Michelle, and I did have to raise her performance with her. I had complaints from the Home Office manager about the quality of some of the audits that she had quality assured herself, and I had cause to raise that with her. But I didn't try and get her to falsify documents. That wasn't the case.
Chair, just noticing the time, I think that I probably have around 20 more minutes of questioning. I wonder whether you'd consider sitting a bit later than normal today.
I think that's fine, and probably preferable to having to ask you to come back tomorrow morning if you're okay to continue for another 20 minutes, and that's okay with the transcribers for another 20 minutes. Thank you, Ms Townsend. Yes, please carry on.
Thank you. I want to turn now to staff culture.
Mm-hmm.
You said in your witness statement, paragraph 48, that during the relevant period I would describe this culture amongst SMT as being fractured, confrontational and mistrustful. I felt that certain members of the SMT focused on their performance progression rather than that of the team. There were trusting relationships between individuals within the SMT, but there was a lack of trust within the team as a whole. Who was focused on their own performance, as you suggested there? Own performance progression, rather.
I think there were a couple of individuals that felt like they were performing above others and wanted to highlight that, and yeah, Michelle Brown would have been one of them.
And who else?
I think I had less experience of Stacey Dean, but I think elements of her behaviour at times indicated the same.
And what effect do you think that fractured, confrontational and mistrustful culture on the SMT have on lower staff lower down the chain, so DCMs and DCOs?
Well, we've talked previously about how culture has to come from the top, so if it's fractured at the top, that's going to flow down through the managers to the staff. It doesn't create a healthy environment. And if they don't trust, if an SMT doesn't trust each other, then how can you expect to be trusted by staff?
And did you see any manifestations of that within the behaviour of DCMs or DCOs?
I think there were quite a lot of sort of grievances raised by staff at the time as well, some of which I was asked to deal with in terms of investigations. There was just, I think, just a general feeling that people didn't trust each other, or that staff didn't trust managers. Not every manager, that would be unfair. I think there were people that were trusted, but there was a general theme of mistrust, I think.
And what effect, if any, do you think that had on the care of detained persons?
Well, I think it's if people are concerned about trust, they may not come to you with issues that they're particularly concerned about.
And so could that have affected detained persons raising complaints against staff?
I don't know if I can overly comment on whether it would have affected detained persons. I think it may have prevented staff coming forward with issues if they felt that they weren't going to be listened to or trusted.
And can you think of any specific examples of where that might have been the case?
I just think that, some of the grievances I dealt with, I upheld elements of them for the staff because I felt that things hadn't been managed particularly well. And I could understand why that staff member would have felt aggrieved at the approach that was taken.
But in terms of the care that was then that effect on the care that they provided a detained person, can you see the line of causation there?
Yes.
And was there any specific example of what you can think that had happened?
No, I think the majority of cases I dealt with were staff on staff complaints. Other than the disciplinary hearings that I chaired after the Panorama programme, I think the majority of them were about staff or staff about managers rather than involving detained persons.
But you've suggested there that they then created perhaps a culture where, a mistrustful culture,
Yes.
which meant that perhaps detained persons weren't able to raise complaints against staff.
Yeah, potentially. I didn't have much oversight of detained persons' complaints at that time, only if they were obviously at Tinsley House, so I can't make that direct correlation, but yeah, I would concur in principle that could have happened.
And in terms of staff attitudes towards detained persons, I want to first start with staff attitudes about CNR, control and restraint. If I can ask Zainab to bring up, please, Owen Syrod's, the transcript of Owen Syrod's evidence. It's INQ 000101. It's page 26, please. It's page 102 within that. He says, the question was, were you able, whilst you were at Brook House, to try and combat this kind of culture? He says, later on I was listened to. I'll give you an example. Probably 2019, I had 2 members of staff within 2 weeks bragging about doing CNR. One said, I love doing CNR, I love it. I pulled him up on my own and said, I don't want to hear that. You should know better than that. Another one said it in the staff room. Again, I said it and warned them about it. I spoke to Sarah Newland, the Deputy Director, about it. I didn't mention who it was. I just said, you need to be aware that this could quite easily go back to, what's the word? It's somebody is like a virus that creeps back. So just to be aware that this attitude, and I've challenged it. So effectively I dealt with it, but I didn't want again. It would be quite obvious if it came, if I'd have reported it, if it had come back to me. I assume that you would agree that bragging about and enjoying CNR is a problem. And it's similar to what we saw in many clips in Panorama. What steps did you take, as it was suggested here, in order to combat that?
Well, I think we can see here that Owen did not want to share the names of those individuals with me. I do remember him coming to see me with some concerns, and I can't recall specifically what I did, but I can imagine I would have raised it with the team and said, this is something we need to be aware of. This is something that's come, from a member of staff, and that, that sort of attitude is not tolerated. There's a number of measures in place. The control and restraint training, if we think that people are enjoying it too much or not seeing it for what it is, then we will challenge that. The CNR scenarios for new staff are based around testing their levels of response. So if somebody is calm, then they need to demonstrate that they will not just proceed with use of force. DC Rule 41 is about not provoking detained persons, and I dealt with a case relatively recently where that came to light. That individual's contract was terminated as a result of that. So that's not a culture that we are tolerant of.
And what happened with that individual? What was said that was provoking? What was the incident? If you could describe it very briefly, please. Yeah,
so there was a relatively minor altercation between a detained person and a member of staff over a games console controller. And the detained person became quite confrontational, and instead of taking himself away from that situation, which he could have done, he sort of followed the detained person and carried on the argument, which resulted in a relatively minor use of force. It was a push, but it was ascertained that he should not have behaved in that way. He could have removed himself from that incident rather than continue to pursue that argument with the detained person.
You see there that Owen Syrod describes it coming back like a virus if it's not challenged. You've just mentioned there a particular incident which you've dealt with very recently. Are the same attitudes like that about loving CNR, are they still apparent now within staff, do you think?
No, and like I've said, when that was an isolated incident, and that was dealt with swiftly when it came to our attention, and that's not. Again, I go back to the 3 and 3 tracker where we look at where people are being involved in uses of force. If it's 3 or more in a rolling 3-month period, then we do look at the circumstances and whether they are putting themselves in situations where they are more freely able to use force, because that is not what we encourage at all.
And I assume what you mean there is unplanned uses of force rather than planned, because people could be picked to do the same use of force. And
spontaneous incidents are more of a concern if it's the same individuals getting involved, yes.
I want to ask you now about staff attitudes towards disruptive or manipulative and mentally ill detained persons. I'll just for the purpose of time read this out if that's okay. It's your Veriter interview, VER 00223, page 14, paragraph 193. It's tab 4. Your interview in March 2018, you describe a problem with desensitisation of staff at Brook House and people not being able to understand why detainees behave the way they do, or not wanting to understand. Can you explain what you mean by desensitisation?
Yes, I think that certainly my approach is if somebody's displaying a certain behaviour, it's trying to understand why and what the triggers are for that behaviour so that we can track it back to the root cause and manage that rather than just managing the effect, which may be some sort of disruptive or frustrated behaviour. I think during the relevant period, there were high numbers of detained persons, high numbers of time served foreign national offenders, high rate of incidents, and I think that it from the staff's point of view, I was doing 1 weekend in 6, and I could feel it sometimes that it was like Groundhog Day. It was just response after response, and I think for the staff, they're running to these responses, they're dealing with sometimes violence, sometimes self-harm, sometimes concerted indiscipline. And the pace of that was such that I don't think, they could sufficiently sort of pause and reflect on that. I think that's what I mean by desensitisation. It's this is another fight, another self-harm.
And did that affect the way that staff dealt with people who were self-harming, do you think?
Well, yes, I think we saw evidence of that in the documentary, yes.
Also in your interview, the following paragraph 194, you suggest that staff are unable to understand the disruptive behaviour and that they perpetuate the issue, as they're so nervous about dealing with such detainees that they go in heavy-handed, and that just adds fuel to the fire. Again, in your Aitken interview, INQ 000078, page 3, tab 41, you talk about self-harm being used as manipulation, and that there was you use the expression "boy you cried wolf," meaning it can, quote, erode your ability to identify when it's genuine. Were you at all desensitised to self-harm with and detainees with mental health problems, do you think?
No, and I think as I've said, I was there relatively infrequently, so I don't think I had the same experience as the staff and the managers who were operational at Brook House. Both due to my role when I was there and the frequency that I was there. I did deal with individuals who I felt tried to manipulate the system. Yes.
And what did you mean by officers going in heavy-handed? Are you talking about excessive force used on detained persons in that context?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't recall making that comment. I'm not sure what I meant.
Should we just go to your interview so you can see the context?
Yeah, sure.
It's VER 000223, page 14. Paragraph 194, you said that, however, in order to be able to manage someone's behaviour, you have to understand it. But I don't know how much we do to understand it rather than just write them off as disruptive. Then we almost perpetuate the issue because these individuals become notorious, and then we are almost so nervous about dealing with them that we go in heavy-handed. That just adds fuel to the fire. I think you're talking specifically about D87.
Yes, I am. And so when I say heavy-handed, I don't think I'm referring to use of force. I'm referring to his management whilst he was on Rule 40 conditions at Brook House.
We're going to come on to that a little later. Do you think that kind of attitude about not believing detainees when they were self-harming contributed to a culture where detainees weren't believed and mentally ill detainees ended up getting worse because of it?
No, I think there were some examples of where vulnerable individuals, both because of self-harm and because of mental illness, were were cared for with, sometimes, very compassionate staff. I think there were pockets of the behaviour that we're describing, but I think, a lot of the staff did their best to look after people who, by the very nature of their detention, were vulnerable.
But is there a risk in not believing some detainees, a boy who cried wolf, that you miss cases of genuine self-harm and suicide?
Yes, there is a risk of that, yes.
And therefore, isn't the better approach to assume that somebody is telling the truth and then care for them appropriately?
Yeah, I think there were examples of individuals who were quite explicit about the reasons why they were claiming to self-harm. So there were examples of it, but they were few and far between.
So do you think that attitude of there being a problem with the boy who cried wolf is actually not very helpful?
No, it's not helpful, and you do need to take those threats seriously, and you need to manage them appropriately.
We've heard evidence from Steve Lawton, Shane Farrell, Steve Dix and Stuart Povey-Meyer. I won't bring up all of the references to their inquiry evidence, but we heard from them that they couldn't distinguish between detained persons behaving in ways which were due to their mental illness and those who were being deliberately disruptive. And they said that they still haven't had proper training from Serco on it, and despite of the fact that they are now in senior roles, 2 assistant directors, a DOM and 2 DOMs, I believe. Do you know whether there has been any training in this respect?
So there is mental health awareness training is delivered on the initial training course and as part of the yearly staff refresher. That includes the identification of mental illness and, what to do if you do think somebody is suffering. We have mental health first aiders now on the contract, and we're looking to train our own instructors so that we can widen the number of staff who have access to that training. And Serco is also investing in virtual reality mental health training for staff as well, scenario-based through VR.
Do you think currently that there is adequate training for officers to recognise the symptoms of mental illness and not treating detainees simply as disruptive?
Yeah, so I think when we did the mental health first aid training, which is more than what's delivered as part of the initial training course, we focused on staff members that work in reception and on E-wing, so that sort of early identification of issues and where our more vulnerable residents will reside. There is also a weekly vulnerable adults meeting which is chaired by Dan Horton in his role as AD safeguarding, and that brings together staff from across the centre, from across the discipline, so including DCOs that work frontline with residents, and that enables anybody to raise a concern about a particular individual that they feel may be suffering, and then that would be picked up by the mental health team that are part of the the Practice Plus group healthcare provision at Gatwick.
Well, it does appear that it's currently an issue, given those 4 fairly senior people still working at Serco and Brook House. They still think that that's a problem. Do you accept that?
That might be their view. I wouldn't necessarily agree with it. I think there are, as I've described, there are things in place to assist staff with identifying people with mental illness or flagging where they may be concerned. They're not mental health professionals, so we have to consider professional boundaries, and that's where we would refer to the clinical provision from PPG.
In Michelle Brown's witness statement, INQ 00164, page 3, paragraph 72, she stated that at a particular time in 2020, that she'd done a case review for a detained person on constant supervision when she was duty director. And she said that senior Serco staff, so you and Mr. Hewer, Steve Hewer, she said, I remember saying to them, I've just sat in one of the saddest case reviews ever. The entire panel was moved. And I recall Steve Hewer replying, well, what lies has he been telling you then? I was shocked at this comment, the sheer lack of interest or compassion and denial of an individual's trauma. Do you remember Steve Hewer saying that?
No. And it's not a comment I would readily associate with him either.
I want to ask you about a particular incident that happened on the 14th of April 2017, which was a protest in D-Wing Courtyard. Again, I won't bring up the form. I was going to bring up an incident report by DCM Steve Lawton. But essentially what happened, and you've described this in your witness statement as well at paragraph 98, that you attended as a silver commander, so second in charge in terms of serious incidents.
Yes.
To manage, you attended at Brook House to manage this, the incident as where many residents, I think 30 to 40 residents, had gathered on the D-Wing Courtyard in the evening, and they'd come and protested. But by the time you'd in fact arrived at Brook House, the incident essentially was over. But during this time also there was a detainee, D2045, that had a seizure, and you were managing from afar, I believe, a controlled evacuation of that incident. Is that right?
No, forgive me, I don't know if two incidents have become confused. I definitely remember having to attend for a courtyard protest that was short-lived, because by the time I'd driven the sort of 15, 20 minutes from where I was to the centre, I attended the command suite, and Steve Lawton said to me they've all just come in. So I do recall that, but I don't recall the second element that you've described there.
Perhaps that's not relevant in any case. It is within Steve Lawton's incident report. Do you remember that once the inciters, in inverted commas, of the protest had come off the courtyard, that they were put onto Rule 40?
No.
You don't remember that they were put onto Rule 40?
Not specifically, no.
So Sean Sayer gave evidence in relation to this. In fact, let's bring this up on the screen so that we can all see. It's INQ 000168. That's pages 32 to 33. Page 33, please. And it's little page 131. Top there, line 8. Do you remember trying to think back at the situation where people, including D2497, being moved to CSU to punish them for their involvement in the protest? And he says, the use of CSU and even E-Wing, it wasn't a decision that we made. We were instructed to take people there, so whoever made that decision, it wasn't me. Would that have been your manager, Steve Dix? Manager, or if there'd been SMT on the site at the time, then it would have been one of them. But we never made a decision to take someone to CSU. Do you remember, just looking at the protest itself, do you remember what the protest was about?
No.
Was it clear? Do you remember it being clear at the time that there was something that was being protested about specifically? I don't know, food, for example, or indefinite detention, or whatever it might have been.
I honestly don't recall the reason for them protesting. I remember getting the phone call and saying that there was a relatively large group of, I think it was Albanian residents on a courtyard that didn't want to come in. I remember making my way in, and literally as I got there, they'd come in. So it was a relatively sort of low-level incident, as I recall it.
And did you consider that detained persons had a right to protest at Brook House?
Yes, it wasn't uncommon that they did. And, staff would go down and engage with them, try and understand what was driving it. A lot of the time it was around Home Office decisions, which, as the contractor weren't within our gift to resolve. But, we'd listen to them, we'd make commitments to take their concerns to the Home Office if that's indeed what it did involve.
Were detained persons involved in protest routinely put on Rule 40?
Not as a result of something relatively passive like that. No, I mean, I think the incident I dealt with, there was, way too many for us to have physically accommodated them on Rule 40. And what was the point? If they're already frustrated, we would only exacerbate that by placing them on Rule 40 conditions as a result of raising their concerns.
Sean Sayers said that it would have been a manager, possibly someone on the SMT, who'd have authorised Rule 40 in relation to that protest. Were you the member of the SMT who authorised that Rule 40?
I don't recall anybody going on Rule 40 as a result of that incident.
In general, as you've said, there were times, though, where there were protesters who were put on Rule 40. Is that what your evidence is?
Sorry, no, that specific courtyard incident, like I say, I don't recall any conversations about anybody going on Rule 40 as a result of it. They'd come in, they'd had their say, the incident was dealt with. In terms of who authorised the use of Rule 40, it would have sat at the duty director level for something that wasn't as a result of a spontaneous incident. So Rule 40 enables the contractor to take urgent action as a result of perhaps a physical fight. But any planned use of it that wasn't sort of in urgent circumstances had to be agreed with the Home Office. So that would usually be done at the duty director level, yes.
I want to ask you almost finally about the treatment of D87, which we touched on earlier. You said in your Verita interview, I won't bring it up for time purposes, but VER 000223, pages 13 to 14, that D87 was manipulative, that he'd come from prison for removal, but if the removal had failed, that he would have to come back to prison.
Yes.
And that he was potentially disruptive, and he would often threaten to go. He was on constant supervision because he knew that you wouldn't transfer him back to prison, and so he was essentially manipulating the system because he didn't want to go back. In your witness statements, paragraph 62 to 64, you said that there was a lengthy period of Rule 40. He was on a lengthy period of Rule 40 due to the threats he made to cause disruption. When you say lengthy period, do you know how long that was?
No, I'm sorry, I don't recall.
Was it a matter of days or weeks or how long roughly?
I think it would have been nearer weeks than days.
I would say weeks, up to a month.
I honestly can't say. I do remember dealing with D87 when I was duty director one weekend, and I do recall him voicing his frustration at the length of time he had been on Rule 40, but I couldn't give you a specific time frame, I'm afraid.
You said in your Verita interview that we restricted his regime to the point where he was a big man and he was in that little room on Rule 40 for a protracted amount of time because of the potential risk he posed. And every day was a long and uncomfortable debate with a very frustrated individual who was saying, all right, I've made a few comments, but I actually haven't done anything and you are still holding me here. Some of it would be, if you come off this constant supervision, then we can transfer you can have more of a regime. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I hadn't noticed that I'd said that. I'd inadvertently said the detainee's name, so we just have to pause a minute.
Just while we pause, how long do we
Just
think
a
we
couple
have
of
to
minutes.
go? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
There is a general restriction order, but I would ask for a specific restriction order to be made, in particular over that detainee, please.
Thank you indeed. Happy to do so.
Thank you. Apologies, Chair. So it would be D87. If you come off a constant supervision, then we can transfer you somewhere where you can have more of a regime. Don't get me wrong, it can work both ways. But if you mention D87, we made a decision to move him from E-Wing to the CSU. We ended up having to restrain him to do it. He was a big man, so he injured some staff, and before you knew it, everyone was terrified of dealing with D87. He said that he was frustrated, and it was difficult to ascertain if his threats were credible. What threats were those?
I don't know whether he'd made threats to sort of possibly to take staff hostage or to cause damage to the centre. It was something of that nature.
You said that in your witness statement, paragraph 62 to 64, that no incremental steps had been taken, and so he's subjected to the strictures regime. Why hadn't those incremental steps been taken, do you know?
I don't know. I can only assume that people felt that he may carry out those threats. When I dealt with him, his regime had already been put in place. So my role as the duty director would be the daily review. So I would go and see any individual that was on Rule 40. Sometimes the decision was mine about whether they would remain on Rule 40 or not, but in other cases they had already been extended for a period. So I would just be doing the daily review, which is what I recall with D87, and it was a lengthy conversation. He felt he was being treated unfairly. I specifically remember he was asking to go to the chapel when I dealt with him, but that wasn't part of the regime that had been put in place for him, which is what I had to explain to him.
And as duty director, could you not have changed that management of Rule 40?
The regime had been put in place for D87 by the Brook House management team. So if I had made changes to that and he had carried out those threats, then that responsibility would have sat solely with me. And, you know, I did have concerns about whether people would be, whether their safety would be compromised if I'd have done that.
Finally, I want to ask you a final question about staff culture. You've made in your Veritor interview criticisms of Steve Skitt and Dan Horton. Say that Steve Skitt, that he was ex-military, that he said that, or you believe that he thought rather, that ex-military police and prison guards make good DCMs, and that you were concerned that he got the deputy director role because he was a part of an old boys network. You also described Dan Horton as lazy and too easy to please Steve Skitt. We know that both Horton and Skitt are still members of the SMT at Serco. They're both assistant directors.
Yes.
And that Skitt is a assistant director of operations, which he describes as managing the day-to-day operations of Brook House. So he clearly has a significant role over operations. Does that concern you, given these individuals are still a part of the SMT in setting the culture and tone of the centre?
No, I think the views I offered at the time were obviously some time ago now, and based on limited interaction with those individuals in my role at Tinsley House. I think, you know, Dan is quite laid back, but I have a different view of Dan now. I think he lacked confidence at the time and was, you know, concerned at challenging things because of the reaction he may receive as a result of that. And I think, you know, Steve Skitt had spent a long time in the prison service before he, both with the public and then public sector and then with G4S before he came to Gatwick. And I think there was a period of transition for Steve. And I just don't think he was given sufficient support and guidance to make that transition more easy for him.
Thank you, Miss Newland. I don't have any more questions. Chad, do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions for you. Thank you very much for coming to give your evidence today.
I'm told that the transcript didn't quite catch up, so please can I request for the restriction order again to be made of D87?
I understand that there's a general restriction order in place, but I will make one in respect of that particular individual breach. Thank you very much, Mr. Townsend. Thank you, as I say, for coming to give your evidence today.
Return again at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow at 10.